Thank you to Rabbi Cosgrove for joining us today for what's bound to be an extremely thoughtful session on matters that are on all of our minds. Welcome to everyone who's tuned in, wherever you are. I hope your day is as sunny and bright as it is in Bloomington. And thanks to the miracle of Zoom, Gunther and I sit here in Bloomington, Indiana. Rabbi Cosgrove sits in New York City, and we know people are tuning in from all over the world for this session. It's going to be a very special session. Gunther just mentioned this book, which I'm proud to have in front of me and urge all of you, in fact, to acquire and get to read. Lots and lots of people, thank goodness, have been writing thoughtful work about what's changed since October the 7th. This book is among the most lucid, best informed, and most thoughtful of all that I've read. Gunther is putting a link to it right now in the chat. You'll be able to order it whenever you have time. Our institute focuses in particular on contemporary anti-Semitism. That will be part of our discussion today. We all recognize that October 7th marks a turning point in history. Life today is not the same as it was before. Rabbi Cosgrove's book and his discussion with us today will deal with a number of those changes. I should add a personal note as well. I not only admire and learn from him as a thought leader, but Rabbi Cosgrove, I'm proud to say, is my rabbi. My beloved companion, Gail Nichols, and I are members of his synagogue. It's a little odd to have a synagogue 700 miles away from where we live, but what he does at the Park Avenue Synagogue, together with a fabulous cantor and other wonderful clergy, is unmatched. So, Rabbi Cosgrove, we owe you not just thank you, but tribute, not just for appearing today, but for all the wonderful things you do week after week after week, day after day after day, spending the high holidays with you. In fact, this year was a real high point in our life. So we're grateful to you. May you have the strength of body, mind, and spirit to continue all your work. It's very, very important work. Now, talking about your work, we're going to talk about your written work today. Let's get started by talking about the title of your book, For Such a Time as This, on Being Jewish Today. I hand over to you.
Alvin and Gunther, thank you so much for the warm and gracious welcome. It really means the world on a personal level, and you told me to dispense of titles. So if I slip and I don't call either of you professor, as is your due, it's as a sign of friendship and warmth, and hopefully to be reciprocated throughout this dialogue together. It is really, I have some very warm memories of being in Bloomington myself. We should start out with a spirit of friendship and collegiality, but I do need to admit that they were back in my college days as an undergraduate at University of Michigan, though I do want to wish Mazal Tov to Indiana on the Huskies. And may we all go from strength to strength. Certainly, my Wolverines need all the help they can get here. We'll dive right into the book, and I thank you for your gracious words of welcome and recommendation for the book. So the title of the book, For Such a Time as This, takes its cue from the biblical book of Esther. And it's really the biblical spine of the story I construct, which is a far-ranging story. And I'm sure we're going to pivot to all these topics of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, hyphenated Jewish identities as American Jews, the generational divide between an older and a younger generation, what we're seeing on college campuses, as well as, of course, any reflections on the relationship between diaspora, Jewry, and Israel. So all of that is in the book, but the cue takes from a moment in time in ancient Persia, where the biblical book of Esther is situated. And Esther, whose name at birth is Hadassah, in the first couple chapters, enters into the king's palace and hides her Jewish identity. She dresses, speaks, acts as a Persian, and in doing so is able to win the beauty contest of the day, rise to the heights of power. In Esther's case, she changes her name to Esther, which actually means to hide, and so she's hidden her Jewish identity and becomes queen. And the going is pretty good. And then cometh Haman, the nemesis of the Jewish people, who lays down a decree that on such and such date, which we now know to be the springtime festival of Purim, which is why we read the book of Esther on Purim, is a moment in time where the fate of the Jews, hitherto thought to be fairly comfortable, becomes literally on the line. And Esther is approached by her uncle Mordecai by way of an emissary, and says, who communicates to Esther, and I say this in the epigraph of the book, don't think that you can hide and escape the decree against the Jews. Who knows if it was not for such a time as this, et kazod in Hebrew, that you've arrived at this station in life. And that's in chapter 4. And as the chapters of the book of Esther unfold, it's the moment that Esther assumes her identity as a queen, as a woman, as a Jew, and finds what I call her Esther moment. And her Esther moment is rising to the occasion of able to assert her Jewish self, and ultimately, because we still celebrate it today, win the day against Haman's wicked plans. And I think this backdrop offers an opportunity to understand our own moment as American Jews, because Alvin, as no one knows this history better than you and your colleagues, but the story of the American Jewish community, like the story of Esther, was really one of accommodation, assimilation from an old world to a new world, and a belief that American Jews were really an exception to the rule, right? That our story was going to be different than our European counterparts, that our story was going to be different than the multi-millennial sense of vulnerability and persecution, that somehow we were comfortable as American Jews in ways that were the exception to the rule. And I think on October 7th, and maybe I'll wrap up here my introductory comment to your simple question, which is not so simple about the title of the book, is that I think on October 7th, many people woke up and realized that maybe it ain't so. Maybe America is not quite as hospitable to American Jews as we would have had ourselves to believe. And so my rabbinate this last year, and the book is one of them, but there's also been advocacy, philanthropy, education, Israel engagement, and otherwise, is a story of rising up, for me, defining what my Esther moment is. I think for you, for Gunter, for people on this group webinar, everyone will rise up to this moment differently. Volunteerism, writing, philanthropy, if you can. Everyone will have their own way of rising up to this moment, but we all need to find our way, as did Queen Esther in days of old.
Thanks for setting that forth. That's helpful for sure. And thanks in particular for talking about the situation of Jews in America. Most of us have lived here in a way that was welcoming, that enabled us to integrate into American society across the board. During the 30s and 40s, things were not always so cushy, we know, but in the post-war period, American Jews certainly felt accepted and have done well in many, many respects. I know your own family dates back to Scotland, but you've been in the country, your parents have been in the country a number of years. In my case, my parents were both born in what is today Ukraine, in an area called Podolia. The best thing they did was leave and come to America because they thought life here would be a lot better, and they were right. I won't say they were anything but right, but right now we're living in a special moment, a very tense and troubled moment. There's no doubt about it. Anti-Semitism, we all know, dates back a long, long time. It waxes and wanes in different places at different times. Right now, though, in America, it seems to be accelerating. It takes more than one form. It manifests itself in various ways. In your book, you talk about the higher and the lower forms of anti-Semitism. How about if you expand on those distinctions a
Sure.
little bit?
Absolutely. And I just want to pick up on two threads before I dive into the higher and the lower anti-Semitism. Number one is, and we can unpack this. You're in charge, Alvin, or Gunther's in charge. I think the events of October 7th were experienced differently by different segments, some chronological, but not entirely so, of the American Jewish community. For
Mhm.
some people, October 7th was a shock, an absolute shock. Where did this hatred come from? How is it possible that there can be such a porous and pernicious line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, whether it's coming from the progressive left or the white nationalist right? It doesn't matter. How did we not see this coming? And I think that was one response to October 7th. The second response was no, it was there all along. It might have been brought into full relief on October 7th, the precarious condition of American Jews. But I think that for many, this is actually a reversion to the norm, that we had a bit of a hiatus from, call it post-World War II to maybe the last 5-10 years. But that is really, this is what Jews have known all along. And I think part of the generational schism right now is situated on that difference, whether it was a shock or not. In my chapter specifically on anti-Semitism, though that theme really is a thread that runs through the entire book, is a distinction that's not mine, but Solomon Schechter's, one of the founding ideologue of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I went to rabbinical school, and arguably one of the founders of American Judaism as we know it today. In 1903, following the Kishinev pogroms, he gave a lecture actually to Hebrew Union College in honor of Kaufman Kohler, where he made a distinction between the higher anti-Semitism and the lower anti-Semitism. And let's start with the lower. The lower anti-Semitism, and he reflects back on his Romanian youth, is the rough and tumble, vulgar, being beat up on his way home from Cheder. That was really, you could put your finger on it. It came with a bloody nose. It was violent, and it was explicit. That is the lower anti-Semitism. Now, in Schechter's day, and this is actually what he was talking about, a little bit of a tangent, for the higher anti-Semitism is more of a genteel, aristocratic marginalization of the Jewish people, not so much with acts of violence, but acts of intellectual delegitimization that would render the Jewish people less safe or hospitable or welcome or otherwise. In Schechter's day, the state of Israel in 1903 obviously didn't exist. So you took the most valuable thing that the Jews had and you cut the legs out from under it and therefore marginalized the Jewish people by extension, which in his day was the Hebrew Bible. And so to criticize, delegitimize the divine authority of the Hebrew text for Schechter was an expression of anti-Semitism, and he called higher criticism, which is the criticism of the Hebrew Bible, to be an expression of higher anti-Semitism. Now let's jump 120 years henceforth to 2023 and 24. We have woken up to a moment where the vulgar lower anti-Semitism can be seen by anyone with eyes to see. That could be graffiti on defacing a synagogue or a hillel on campus. That can be a violent act of kids being beat up as they were at Pitt, as they were at Michigan. I am sure you have stories at Indiana of kids being physically or verbally attacked. It can happen in online forms. There are a million expressions of what we'll call the lower anti-Semitism, some of it coming from the progressive left, some of it coming from the nationalist right. Again, it doesn't matter. The fist feels the same no matter where it comes from. But what we've also discovered, and maybe has been rendered more public in this last year and change since October 7th, is the higher anti-Semitism. And that's happening in, it could be film festivals, it could be academic conferences that exclude pro-Israel voices, Zionist voices, who are marginalized, excluded from public discourse, because to support the right of Jews for self-determination in their historic homeland, not the Bible now, it's our proudest object, the state of Israel, thereby that becomes unaccepted. And so from the highest levels of intellectual discourse to a hillel on campus not being allowed to be included in student organizations, because by dint of being a Jewish organization, they are also a supportive or engaged with Israel and Zionism, to look, it happens in my office as a rabbi all the time. Parents who are worried that their teenage kids have a Jewish name, Maya or otherwise, and they're in the back of a cab and they're Uber. They are worried about, is it safe? It could be because they come out of my Hebrew school singing Jewish songs, and they wonder whether they have to shush their kids as they get on the subway to go home, for fear that public displays, yarmulkes, or singing Hebrew songs is going to be received peaceably on the streets of New York. So it happens, and with here I'll stop. Higher or lower, there's a slide from one to the next that happens seamlessly, imperceptibly, and very quickly. And so even the higher, I believe, is a deep, deep threat to the Jewish people.
Right. Günther, let's bring you into this discussion as well. You don't start out life in America, but you've told me more than once that what's happening here, you saw happening in Europe 10 years ago. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll ask Rabbi Cosgrove, in fact, to take it at a still more closer way.
Right. Yes, I was thinking along these lines when Elliot, you were making this distinction between the higher and lower anti-Semitism. Back 20 years ago, there was a huge wave of anti-Semitism in Europe, mostly Western Europe, during the Second Intifada, but also just after 9/11 and during the Iraq War. A lot of conspiracy theories about Jews in a political form of anti-Semitism, which might be the one that you said is higher anti-Semitism, or as Bernard Harrison phrased it, political anti-Semitism versus social anti-Semitism. It's a little bit different, I think, the two categories. But yes, and when I came to this country almost a decade ago, it was a different place. Anti-Semitism was one of many problems, but it was not on the minds of so many people as it is today, not with this urgency. So that, I think, has changed a lot. So I saw that you had a chapter on two worlds of Judaism, Israel and the diaspora. And I think in your congregation, correct me if I'm wrong, but most are Jews living in New York, but you also have a lot of Israelis. So maybe you see firsthand these different worlds. And so I would be interested to hear what on October 7th, how maybe there were different perceptions of that, what happened, maybe how sometimes even the two worlds were even brought together in some ways or not. So I would be really interested to see, how that over the last year maybe has developed, and what you have heard and what you think about these different worlds, and about the perceptions of October 7th, which of course in Israel is very direct, the direct threat and the trauma after October 7th, but it was also a trauma, of course, in this country to see what happened and the reactions to it. So we had a delegation from some Israelis here who were worried about students, Jewish students here in Indiana. So it's a complicated setting.
Yeah. And the book, just to be clear, though, I do touch a little bit on, the day after and two-state solutions. It's not a geopolitical book about Israel. It's about American Jewry. But Gunther, as you yourself and Alvin, you noted, I'm as American as they come. I'm born and bred in Los Angeles, but my roots are not American. And I went to summer camp in Europe, and my immediate family is all in Europe or in Israel now. And so for me, proud American as I am, I really see, but for the vagaries of history, I could have been there or there. My cousin's experience that I describe at some length of being beat up in the UK, that could have just as easily been me had my mother gone this way as opposed to that way. So I make a distinction in the book, and Gunther, I'm not sure if this is useful or finds its analog in the European experience, between what I call Genesis Jews and Exodus Jews. And here again, it's not my idea. It's an idea that my teacher and friend, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, constructed, but I take it in a very different direction. That the book of Genesis in chapter 12 describes Abraham's first call by God to go forth to a land that I will show you, where you shall be a blessing. This is a positive expression, identification with the Jewish people as a particular people, with a universal message, a really dynamic, wonderful expression of what it means to be a Jew. In the book of Exodus, the very first verses describe the rise of a new Pharaoh who sees the Jewish people as different, as to be feared, possibly a fifth column, and therefore subjected and subjugated in the Egyptian oppression. And that's an Exodus identity which is defined by the hatred and fears of others. And so you have two, and it's not perfect. There are examples of Genesis and Exodus and Genesis, but it's a useful heuristic to think about how Jewish identity is conceived of by Jews. And people may or may not have had a Genesis identity prior to October 7th. Some people very engaged, some people less engaged. But on October 7th, every American Jew became an Exodus Jew. Every American Jew understood themselves being defined by the other. And you remember, even as Israel was counting its bodies, they were being thrust from position of victim to aggressor. And we all woke up. How could this be? And then the subsequent events of the entire year. And so that sense of being othered, of being marginalized, has two different forms. On the one hand, a certain existential loneliness that we feel persecuted, vulnerable, unsafe. It's also resulted in a surge of Jewish identity. That can happen by dint of people going to synagogue. That can be by way of philanthropy, by way of advocacy, by way of education, if people are in a position to do so, to travel on solidarity missions to Israel. This last year, Gunther, of my rabbinate, I have seen, normally a rabbi tries to pull in volunteers to get involved in committee work and things like that. This year, I have had more people looking to get involved than I can actually respond to. And so I wouldn't choose it for all the tea in China, right? The atrocities of October 7th and the wake up of October 7th, horrible. But it is a question that I ask myself, how in this moment, as the book says, for such a time like this, that we have all found ourselves being defined as the other, as American Jews, how can we still maintain and sustain, please God, beyond trauma, this sense of Genesis Jewish identity, that we can have positive points of Jewish expression, literacy, love of the Jewish people. It was great to be a Jew on October 6th. It's great to be a Jew today. I just think we need to figure out a way to inhabit the both and, not the either or.
Yeah, I guess the October 7th made it for American Jews and around the world, the Jewish identity, to put it in sociological terms, more salient to their identity, the part of their identity, the Jewish part of their identity. And that, as you said, is an Exodus moment. But then, of course, then there's a question how to make something out of that is not only in the negative, and where you have an agency again, which is very difficult in these times to get an agency back. I think that's also what a lot of students, I see Jewish students struggling, because they always then seen as if there's Jewish first name or some other signifiers, if you want, and they cannot, and they don't want to escape it. So yeah, it becomes more salient, but then to do something not only defensive, but something positive with that. So that is very difficult, and I've seen that in Europe for decades and decades, of course. This is a very difficult task then, and in Europe it's also much more difficult because the the Jewish communities in the United States are already, it's a small percentage, but in Europe it's even much smaller, and that makes it in many spaces even more difficult.
Elliot, let me add just one thing to what you said and what Gunther said, and that has to do with the reawakened sense of Jewish peoplehood as such. The last figure I saw indicates that 47% of world Jewry lives in the state of Israel. That's to say, almost 1 out of every 2 Jews alive lives in the state of Israel. And over the years, that figure has been going up, whereas the figure outside of Israel has been somewhat diminishing. Judaism, and here you're the rabbi, not I, but Judaism is certainly a life-affirming religion. And there is no affirmation of Judaism without an affirmation of Jewish peoplehood. Half of us live in Israel. And yet one of the major manifestations of today's anti-Jewish hostility is hostility specifically against Zionism, Israel, and those of us who identify with it. We'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that matter.
Look, for me, to be a Jew is to be part of a land-centered identity, right? I don't have the credentials that you and Gunther have, but there's faith, there's ethnicity, sociologists might define people in different ways. But for me, ever since Genesis chapter 12, to be a Jew is to have a connection of the land. If one fulfills the mitzvah of making aliyah, geh gesund, as they say, but if one does not, then Jewish identity, a constitutive building block of it, is engagement with the 47% of the Jewish people who live in that land. And I, through no merit of my own, have been born into the time when a sovereign state of Israel exists. And so it's inconceivable to me to imagine a Jewish identity. I preach about Shabbat, I preach about Kashrut, I preach about Tzedakah, I preach about a lot of different values. One of those values of what makes for a Jewish identity is engagement with the land people of Israel. I will say this, Alvin, and I don't know if you and I see eye to eye on this, so it'll make it for an interesting discussion. I believe that there are a million different ways to express engagement and love for the land of Israel. And I think one of the gut check dimensions of this moment, a time like this, is that American Jewry needs to do some soul searching, that it went from seeing engagement with Israel as part of Jewish identity to making engagement with Israel a substitute for Jewish identity, to making support for the policies of the state of Israel as the orthodoxy of American Judaism, that to object to this or that policy of this or that Israeli government somehow became a betrayal of the people. And I think that, and I have a whole chapter on this about the Maya generation, the generation of Jews who were not just marginalized by dint of the violence, but they were marginalized because they didn't feel a home in the organized Jewish community. I think when American Jews made support for the Israeli government a litmus test for Jewish identity, we alienated an entire generation who looked and said, wait a second, settlement policies in the West Bank, the euthanization of a two-state solution. Israel is a Goliath against a Palestinian David. The if half of Israel can protest the Israeli government on a Saturday night as an expression of love of country, then the idea that somehow I'm betraying the cause because I'm doing the same in New York or Bloomington or Los Angeles, it's not an argument that holds water. And so I think that I think this was there prior, but I think it's even more so now uh, in this post-October 7th world.
You have a chapter, I think, on the generational divide, and I think you ask yourself the question how to respond to non-Zionist Jewish Gen Z, right? So
Yeah.
maybe you can expand on this a little bit, because I'm not sure if what the majority of like Jewish students feel like, but some definitely feel like a non-Zionist. So I don't have a very firm view on this. So I think would be really interesting to hear about your thoughts, how your thought process was, and what then made it into the book that you said, okay, this is
Yeah.
important.
So I'm the father of 4 college age or thereabout students. So there's something very personal about this book. When those who are on the webinar watching, when people say, well, who's the intended audience? Obviously anyone with a credit card. But beyond that, what I would love this book to be is a book that one generation hands to the next generation, that's read in Hillels across the country, that parents say, oh, I agree with Cosgrove here, I don't agree with Cosgrove there, but it provides a vocabulary. And the centerpiece of that is this chapter on a real dialogue with one of my daughter's friends, who I give the name Maya, which is a discussion about how she, now it actually began prior to October 7th, who doesn't see a nationalist formulation of Jewish identity as part of her own identity. She's not an anti-Zionist, but she's a non-Zionist Jew who doesn't find that her liberal, universal Jewish values, which incidentally she learned by going to Jewish camp, Jewish day school, and not an insignificant amount of money spent on her Jewish education, now sees those values not being expressed by the very state of Israel that she's expected to have some reflexive, unflinching support. And so I model how to have that conversation. Now, I know where I stand, right? As I just said, we can play back the tape. I can't imagine a Jewish identity that's not a Zionist Jewish identity. And by the way, I find it to be somewhat incoherent, right? 47% of our people live in a very rough and tumble neighborhood. The well-being of the state of Israel is an expression of the well-being of the Jewish people, right? What did Golda Meir once say? That if the Arabs laid down their arms tomorrow, there'd be peace. If the Jews laid down their arms tomorrow, there'd be no Israel, right? I'm not Pollyannish about what's going on in the Middle East right now. There are people who want to destroy Israel, and thank God, as evidenced by the last events of the last few days, we live in a time where Israel can punch back. Period out. I'm thankful to God to that moment. But how do we engage the Mayas of the generation? And here we have to have a more expansive, big tent view, aware of missteps we took in the past, and allow for those voices like we do at the Passover Seder, right? What's the paradigm of Jewish education? Of one generation sitting next to another generation, figuring out a way, some not to coddle. Sometimes there's a wicked child who needs to be corrected, but we also figure out the language by which we can all sit at the same table. And Gunther, that means asking probing questions, asking the Mayas of the world, okay, so you don't believe in a nation state of the Jewish people. So let's now put that stated belief next to the counter argument of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. Or let's put that up against the fact that there is presently a ring of fire around the state of Israel who seek Israel's destruction. And then you know what we have to do, Gunther? We have to be quiet. We have to stop talking and let that person, force that person to articulate a response that meets their own criteria of intellectual rigor. Because and then, as I've discovered raising teenage kids, you don't ever win the argument in the moment. But if you plant a seed, then that means when that young person, that Maya, is going to be speaking to her friend and her friend, she might think twice before entering an encampment and standing next to someone with a placard that says from the river to the sea. It won't, no human being, I certainly can't say, okay, you're right, I'm wrong, we're done, right? We all have egos, but the seeds planted in that embracing discussion bear fruit once that person leaves the room. And so I think our Hillels, our organized Jewish community, I think we have to make room for hearing the Mayas out and accept blame for where we made wrong turns along the way.